Welcome to a deep dive. We basically take a whole pile of sources, research notes, everything you've given us, and we try to boil it down to the essentials.
Yeah, getting straight to the core, the really interesting bits you need to know.
Exactly. And today we're looking at David Livingstone, a name, most people have heard, but maybe don't grasp the full picture. He was complex.
Oh, definitely. When you dig into these sources, he's so much more than just, well, an explorer on a map. He was shaped by some pretty incredible, almost unbelievable early experiences.
Right. And driven by this vision that was quite revolutionary for its time, even with all the complexities we see now.
Mm-hmm.
So our goal here, our mission with this deep dive, is to really unpack all that. Look at the key facts, the motivations, the surprising details from these sources give you a clear, informed picture.
And we'll get into some fascinating stuff like his background working in a cotton mill, which is just worlds away from Africa, and his whole idea linking, faith, trade, and civilization.
Plus the personal hardships, which were immense, and just his incredible focus.
Yeah, that unwavering determination.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Where do these sources start his story?
We begin in Blantyre, Scotland, 1813. He was born into a working-class family, and the living situation, well, it was pretty stark.
The sources mentioned a single room in a tenement building.
That's right, a tenement attached to the cotton mill, the whole family, one room, very frugal existence.
And that mill looms large, doesn't it? He started working there just 10 years old.
Yeah, age 10. As a piecer, the sources describe it 14 hours a day.
14 hours.
6 days a week. And he did this for 10 years.
What exactly was a piecer? What did that involve?
It was relentless physical work, basically tying together broken cotton threads on the spinning machinery nonstop.
And physically demanding. I read something about the distance he covered.
Yeah, the sources estimate he walked maybe 34 kilometers, that's about 21 miles, every day, often crawling, bending under the machines. It sounds awful.
He really does.
But ironically, that constant grueling physical effort, it was like unintentional training. It built incredible physical endurance.
Which he definitely needed later on.
Absolutely.
Okay, but here's the part that really struck me from the sources. While doing this back-breaking labor, he was teaching himself.
Amazing, isn't it? He had this intense hunger for knowledge, taught himself Latin, Greek, Hebrew.
How? I mean, when?
He read constantly. Books on travel, science, theology, Wilberforce's Practical Christianity is mentioned. Apparently he'd prop a book up on his spinning machine and read sentence by sentence while working.
While working the machine. Good grief.
And then, after his 14-hour shift, he went to night school.
It just shows this incredible drive, this duality, the physical grind and the intellectual hunger side by side.
It's central to understanding him, I think.
And his family background played a big role too, right? The sources emphasized their devout Christianity.
Very much so. Originally Presbyterian, then they became Congregationalists. His father is described as deeply pious, a consistent example, though also quite strict.
And his mother.
She's noted for her kindness, and interestingly, a real focus on cleanliness. Stanley, years later, actually remarked on Livingstone's immaculate habits even in the wild.
Oh, little details like that. And his grandfather.
Instilled a strong sense of honesty. So you have this bedrock of faith, discipline, honesty.
And within that, he had his own personal spiritual turning point. Around 12, feeling anxious.
Yeah, the sources talk about this period of spiritual struggle, feeling like a sinner, lacking peace. He apparently wept in secret.
But that led somewhere significant.
It did. At 18, he experienced a radical conversion. He felt this profound sense of deep obligation to Christ. That became his absolute anchor.
And that obligation translated into action.
Completely. He resolved then to dedicate his life to alleviating human misery, making the salvation of men his primary goal. It wasn't just a belief, it was his life's work, decided right then.
Which led him, at 21, to decide on becoming a missionary. But initially, not for Africa.
No, surprisingly, his first target was China. He thought being a medical missionary would be more effective there.
So he trained for that specifically.
Yes, studied medicine alongside theology. He qualified as a licentiate of the Faculty of Physicians and Surgeons in November 1840. He was ready to go.
But then world events got in the way.
Exactly. The Opium War broke out, and suddenly China was closed off to him. His plans were completely derailed.
And that's when Africa enters the picture, through a key meeting.
Yes, a pivotal moment. He met Robert Moffat, a veteran missionary who was on leave from South Africa.
And Moffat talked about the work there.
He did, but more than that, he talked about the unreached parts of Africa, the vast interior.
And there's that famous quote the sources highlight, the one about the smoke.
Yes, it apparently gripped Livingstone intensely. Moffat said something like, "I have sometimes seen, in the morning sun, the smoke of 1,000 villages where no missionary has ever been."
Just that image.
That image, plus the description of people without Christ, without God, and without hope, just resonated so deeply with Livingstone's calling. 20 words, they say, changed his direction.
And connected directly to his understanding of the Great Commission, Matthew 28.
Absolutely. The commands go and evangelize were paramount for him. But it was the promise attached, "Lo, I am with you always," that he clung to. He called it the word of a gentleman of sacred and strictest honor.
He really banked everything on that promise.
He staked his entire life on it.
So Africa it was. He sailed for Cape Town, December 1840. And even on the ship, he's learning.
Yeah, typical Livingstone. He used the voyage to study navigation with the ship's captain, learning the sextant and quadrant. He knew he'd need pathfinding skills.
Practical.
Always practical. And the sources also mention an incident in Brazil where he resisted pressure to drink alcohol, standing apart from some other Europeans. Shows his character early on.
Okay, so he arrives in Africa, travels inland to Kuruman, meets Mary Moffat.
Robert Moffat's daughter, yes, they later married. She became a crucial part of his life, though their life together was often incredibly difficult due to his travels.
And his initial work involved setting up mission stations.
Yes, places like Lepalol, Mabotsa, Chanwane, Kolobeng, working with tribes like the Bakwina, the Bakatla.
And his approach wasn't just about preaching.
Oh no, far broader. He certainly preached, the sources say, talking about the unsearchable riches of Christ always moved him. But he was also the doctor, a very busy one.
Using his medical training.
Yes, obstetrics, surgery, eye conditions. And beyond that, practical skills. Teaching building, blacksmithing, gardening, even irrigation. He joked about making rain by digging channels from the river.
So a very hands-on approach to mission.
Very holistic, you might say.
And there are some key stories from this time.
Yeah.
Healing people, translating hymns, and the lion attack.
Ah, yes, the lion attack at Mabotsa, a really defining moment, physically at least.
Left him injured permanently.
Yes, the lion crushed the bone in his upper arm. He couldn't lift it properly for the rest of his life. But characteristically, he drew a spiritual lesson from it.
How so?
He related the gratitude of the people he saved from the lion because his arm was broken, distracting it, to the gratitude people should feel for Christ's sacrifice. His blood shed for them.
Always connecting things back. And his relationship with Chief Sechelle. That seems important.
Very. Sechelle, chief of the Bakwena, became a convert and a strong supporter. He encouraged his whole village to attend the mission school.
And asked that poignant question.
Yes, about his ancestors. Why hadn't they heard the gospel? Had they just died into deep darkness? Livingstone felt that question deeply, saw it as a challenge to the church.
But this period wasn't peaceful. Conflict was brewing with the Boers.
The Transvaal Boers, yes. The sources are quite clear about the tensions. The Boers didn't want missionaries interfering. They wanted to control trade routes, and crucially, they were involved in raiding African communities.
Taking land and people.
Yes, seizing land and capturing people, especially children, effectively as slaves. Livingstone was outspoken against this, writing protests.
And this led to direct conflict.
It culminated in a Boer attack on his mission station at Kolobeng. They destroyed his home, looted his property.
And that pushed him.
It solidified his decision. He needed to move further north, beyond their reach, to find a secure base for a new kind of mission. This really marks a shift.
Toward wider exploration, but still framed as mission.
Absolutely. The sources stress this. Exploration wasn't the goal itself. It served a larger four-part missionary objective that grew out of these experiences.
Okay, what were those 4 parts?
1. Find reliable water sources and good locations for future mission stations. 2. Discover the real nature of Central Africa, debunking the idea it was just desert, showing it had rivers, people, potential.
Right.
3. Find a viable trade route to the coast, preferably one that bypassed the Boers and potentially hostile Portuguese territories, a path for legitimate commerce.
And the 4th?
And 4th, driven by what he'd seen, was to expose and ultimately destroy the slave trade. He called it this open sore of the world. That became a consuming passion.
So exploration was the tool. I think there's a quote about that.
Yes. His famous line, "The end of the geographic fact is but the beginning of the missionary enterprise." Finding a river or a mountain was just step 1.
And this is where his famous 3 C's idea comes in.
Exactly. Christianity, commerce, and civilization. He saw these as intertwined, needing to advance together.
How did he see them working together?
Well, Christianity was the ultimate goal, the spiritual transformation. Commerce, legitimate trade in African goods like cotton, ivory, wax for European products, was the engine to displace the slave trade, give people an economic alternative.
Makes sense. And civilization.
That encompassed things like good governance, education, agriculture, industry, basically raising living standards, creating peace and order, which he believed would create fertile ground for the gospel to take root.
Now, looking back, that civilization aspect, tied to European models, gets criticized as paving the way for colonialism. What do the sources suggest about his intentions?
The sources strongly indicate his motive was primarily anti-slavery and aimed at African well-being and development, not colonial domination for Britain's sake or personal gain. He argued against exploitation.
So, more about enabling indigenous progress.
That seems to have been his vision, yes. He wanted African civil rights, opportunities for them through trade and faith. Now, whether that vision was naive about how European powers would ultimately act is another question. But the intent described seems different from outright imperialism.
It's a complex legacy.
Yeah.
Okay, so these goals led him on some truly massive journeys. That first big one, westwards.
Yeah, the epic trek from Linyanti, deep in the interior, all the way to Luanda on the Angolan coast. 2,000 kilometers. Took 2 years.
And the conditions.
It's just brutal. Constant threats from wild animals, sometimes hostile tribes, and disease. He suffered something like 31 attacks of fever on that one trip. Reached the coast barely alive, described as a bed of bones.
Incredible perseverance. And then there's that story from Luanda about refusing passage home.
A really telling moment. A British naval vessel offered him a trip back to England. He was weak, sick, could have easily gone home a hero.
But he didn't.
He refused because he had promised the Makololo men who accompanied him, sent by their chief Sekalitu out of loyalty, not for pay, that he would see them safely home. He wouldn't abandon them.
Loyalty was a two-way street for him.
Absolutely. And quite dramatically, the ship he turned down was later lost at sea with all hands.
Wow. So he turned around and headed back east.
Yes, retracing his steps and then striking out eastward along the Zambezi River.
And this is where he encountered Victoria Falls.
Correct. He became the first European to see Mosi Otunya, the smoke that thunders. He renamed it Victoria Falls.
But the journey remained incredibly difficult.
Oh, relentlessly so. Crossing swollen rivers, chronic food shortages, dangerous wildlife encounters, buffalo are mentioned, and the ever-present tsetse fly, fatal to his pack animals.
And during these journeys, terrible personal loss too. His wife, Mary.
Yes. Tragically, Mary died of fever at Shupanga on the Zambezi during his second major expedition. A huge blow.
How did he cope with that, according to the sources?
Deep grief, naturally. He wrestled with it, questioned things, but ultimately fell back on his core faith, that promise of Christ's presence even in sorrow. He kept going.
As he traveled, he recorded a lot about the different cultures he encountered. Some descriptions are quite vivid, even startling.
Yes, he was a keen observer. He noted variations in dress, body modifications, lip plugs, teeth filing or removal, different greetings, some quite elaborate.
But also customs he found deeply disturbing.
He did. Things like funeral rituals involving human sacrifice, the displaying of skulls as trophies, beliefs about chiefs transforming into lions. He found these things frankly repugnant.
And the poison ordeal.
That particularly horrified him. This practice, used to detect witchcraft, resulted in thousands of deaths. He saw it as pure evil.
How did he reconcile seeing these things with his mission?
He described heathenism as disgusting, lamenting the state of people living without Christian knowledge. But, and this is crucial, he never stopped seeing them as people for whom Christ died. His response was prayer and a renewed commitment to fight against what he saw as the forces of Satan and the slave trade holding them captive.
Which brings us back to that open sore of the world. The slave trade seems to have increasingly dominated his later focus.
It did. He witnessed its horrors firsthand, especially the Arab slave trade in East and Central Africa. The descriptions in his journals are graphic.
Like what?
Corpses floating down rivers were a daily sight. He wrote about needing to clear bodies from the paddles of his canoe, entire regions depopulated, landscapes strewn with human bones.
Just devastating.
He encountered the slave caravans, lines of people yoked together, often brutally treated. He described the despair, the suffering.
Did he intervene directly?
Sometimes. There's an account of him and his men freeing a group of 84 captives after their drivers fled. Those freed people apparently formed the nucleus of a Christian community later. He also visited the notorious slave market in Zanzibar.
A grim experience, I imagine.
Hundreds being bought and sold, he was appalled. It's noted that a cathedral was later built on that very spot, a powerful symbol.
All this leads, eventually, to that famous meeting. He'd been out of contact for years.
Yes, people in Europe and America feared he was dead. The New York Herald newspaper famously dispatched the journalist Henry Morton Stanley to find him.
And Stanley found him. That classic scene.
A white man is coming.
One of Livingstone's men shouted, and Stanley's famous, possibly slightly rehearsed greeting.
Dr. Livingstone, I presume?
The very one.
But what's perhaps more interesting is Stanley's reaction to Livingstone.
What did Stanley make of him? He wasn't exactly predisposed to admire missionaries, was he?
No, Stanley was quite cynical initially, but he spent 4 months with Livingstone and was completely won over. He wrote later that he never found a fault in him.
High praise.
He noted Livingstone's gentleness, his unwavering piety, describing it as true, practical Christianity, not just talk. Stanley himself, the reports say, was deeply impacted spiritually, even converted by Livingstone's example.
Yet, even after Stanley found him, offered him supplies, a way home, Livingstone stayed.
He refused to leave. Stanley pleaded with him, but Livingstone felt his work wasn't done. He still needed to find the sources of the Nile, believing it was key to understanding the continent's geography and potentially opening it up.
I must finish my task, he reportedly said.
That was his resolve. They parted ways, Stanley heading back to report his scoop, Livingstone turning back into the interior.
For his final journey? And these last years were incredibly hard.
Extremely difficult. He was weakened by chronic illness, dysentery, bleeding, often in severe pain. His loyal African companions, especially Susi and Chuma, frequently had to carry him.
But he kept pushing on. His last journal entry.
Written on his 59th birthday, March 19, 1873. He rededicated himself to Christ and prayed, "My Jesus, my King, my life, my all, I again dedicate my whole self to thee. Accept me. Grant, O gracious one, that I may finish my task this year."
And he died not long after that. The scene of his death is very moving.
It is. Found by his men in his hut in Chitambo's village early one morning. He wasn't in his cot, but kneeling beside it.
As if in prayer.
Exactly. It seemed a fitting end for a man whose life was so defined by prayer and reliance on God. His last recorded prayer echoes that birthday wish. Good and gracious Jesus, stay with me, Lord, till my work is done.
And the dedication of Susi and Chuma after his death.
It's extraordinary. They made the difficult decision to preserve his body, removing his heart and internal organs, burying them under a tree there in Africa, and then carried his embalmed body and his precious journals for months, over 1,000 miles to the coast.
An incredible act of loyalty and respect.
It truly is. It ensured his work wasn't lost and allowed for his eventual symbolic burial.
In Westminster Abbey, London, April 1874, a huge national event.
The highest honor Britain could bestow. Stanley was there, Robert Moffat too. A recognition of his impact, even if complex. But, as you said, his heart remained in Africa.
Looking back across his whole life, painstakingly pieced together from these sources, the mill boy, the missionary, the doctor, the explorer, the abolitionist, facing incredible hardship, loss, hostility. What's the constant thread?
It really seems to be that deep, unwavering faith, specifically his reliance on that promise from Matthew 28, "Lo, I am with you always."
He mentioned it often.
Yes, he declared those words never failed him. He wrote about feeling supported by that promise when facing death, surrounded by potential enemies. "It is the word of a gentleman of the most sacred and strictest honor," he wrote, so there's an end of it. That certainty carried him through.
Even near the end, when things looked bleakest.
Even then, faced with overwhelming suffering and what he saw as savagery, tempted to despair, his prayer remained focused. "Stay with me, Lord, till my work is done."
So as we wrap up this deep dive into David Livingstone, based on these sources, it's quite a journey we've traced. From that single room in Scotland to becoming this global figure who walked vast stretches of Africa.
Driven by that potent mix of faith, scientific curiosity, practical skill, and sheer, almost unbelievable perseverance.
A life of immense achievement, but also, as we've seen, not without its complexities and the difficult questions raised by his methods and context.
Definitely. Resilience, vision, contradiction,
Okay.
It's all there.
So for you listening, having heard this distillation from the sources, what aspects of Livingstone stand out most? Is it the grit born from the mill, the passionate fight against slavery, that blend of medicine and mission, or maybe the enduring questions around his 3 C's philosophy?
And here's a final thought to maybe chew on. Livingstone put enormous faith in that combination of Christianity, commerce, and civilization as the cure for Africa's ills, particularly slavery, reflecting on his experience and that specific belief system. What does it make you consider about the ways different forces, be it faith, economics, political ideas, cultural exchange, interact and shape our world today? Sometimes as intended, and, well, sometimes in ways that lead to very different outcomes.